It's fun to be here again. Um, we are going to, I'm going to share my screen in just a second and I'll have some slides and we'll go through. There were handouts. I wanted to let you know that I will also, after this is over, send to Bethany the handouts, but all filled in. So don't worry about if you like to take notes. I need to write things down to remember them. So I like to have things to fill in. So I will send out the notes with everything filled in. I wanted to let you know that. Okay. And then if you have questions during the time, please just type them in. There should be a question box somewhere. You can type those in and then we'll go over them at the end, or you can just ask them at the end. Either way is fine. But just know that if it's good for you to go ahead and type it in and not worry about it, do that. Then I will answer them all at the end. Okay. So we are going to start with our story structure. And so this is a really great topic for me. I've enjoyed learning this. I am, in general, a nonfiction writer, but I had this novel that I wanted to write for many, many years. And so when I started it, I had sort of a sense of, I don't know what to do. The first blank page was blinking at me, and I'm thinking, I don't know how to start, and how do I know where to go? And that is where I found some resources to study story structure. And it was amazing once I started to see all that is there. It is a roadmap to your book. It helps you know both what to do and what not to do. And that is a very wonderful thing. It doesn't confine you. It keeps you from wasting time of going down the wrong road. My name is Susan Macias. I have a blog that I've written on for many years. I have a couple of books that I've self-published and a few more that are in the pipes to self-publish. And I have completed my novel. I've now completed it twice because I rewrote it. I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. But I love to write. And it took me several years in that journey to call myself a writer, but I now call myself a writer. It's one part of me. I have other parts too. And I don't make a lot of money, and it's not my living. If I had to live off of it, I wouldn't do it. I couldn't do it, but I am a writer. E.B. White said, I admire anybody who has the guts to write anything at all. E.B. White wrote Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little, Trumpet of the Swan, among other things. But it is not easy to write. So if you are trying to write and you say, well, obviously I can't write because it's hard. Actually, that just means you're doing it correctly, because it is hard. And don't ever think that it's not surprising when it is. That means that it is just right. Keep going. It is hard, but it is worth it. So I think every story matters. Stories are a way to paint a picture and convey truth that might be difficult or dry if just told. A story embodies things, embodies truth. And so that is part of their value. You know, Jesus in the New Testament did much of his teaching in parables. They were stories. They were ways to relate truth in a way that was easier to understand. Memoirs are a wonderful way for us to take truth that has occurred in our life and share it with others. Memoirs are stories. They actually follow the same story structure as a fiction book would. And so every story matters. And that is what we want to do with story structure. We want to give a frame. Every structure, every physical structure has a frame, and it needs a frame to stand up. Every voyage needs a map, or you're going to wind up in the wrong place. So we have our framing of a house to hold it up, to establish the rooms, and to confine it in a way to have all of the inside to be able to create. We also have a map so that we go from point A to point B to point C, and we get all the places we need to go. They don't confine us, they help us get to where we need to go. It can be complicated or simple. There's actually, once you get on, you start studying story structure, it's sort of a rabbit hole that you can get sucked down and never actually write a story because you keep trying to figure out which structure you want to use. I found that I needed to keep it simple. If you are an outliner, if you like to outline your story before you start writing, then there are a lot of resources for that. If the other alternative in the fiction world, they call it, you're either an outliner or you're a pantser. And a pantser means you fly by the seat of your pants. And so that means you are going to just kind of write and discover your story as it goes. I'm somewhere in the middle. I like to start writing, then come in with my structure, figure out what I have, what I need, where do I need to go. And so there's lots of options. I'm going to talk about this picture a little more later, but this is a story arc by a woman named Susie Flory. If you write memoir, she's someone you want to follow, and go to her website, susieflory.com. This is, you can see where it says Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. This is a story needs to be divided up into different parts. And often when we write story, we're going to end up with these things, whether we are doing it specifically or not, because it's sort of inherent in every story to have this rise up to the final situation and then you end it. But I wanted to show you this picture. This is her making sure, as she had written a bunch, making sure that each chapter fit in as it should, and she had what she needed. So we're going to go over the parts of the story. What are the classic parts of story structure? Now, I will tell you, this is how I work. If you go to other places, and I'm going to give you resources at the end, so there's lots and lots of places to study and get more information, you'll find that there are even more terminology that you can use and that sort of thing. But this is what we're going to talk about. You have your opening, you have an inciting event, a series of crises, a turning point, a climax, and then the end. So each one of these has a job to do in propelling the story forward. And that's really the job of story structure. It's like the engine, making sure that you're making progress down the road and you're not just sitting there having a picnic, not getting anywhere. People go to story to be intrigued, no matter what genre you're in, whether it's romance or it is speculative fiction. People go to a story to be intrigued, to have characters that they get to know and want to know what happens. And that's what structure does. It takes us through the story. Okay. The opening sets the stage for your story. Think about if you're at a play and the curtains draw back. Immediately when you see the setting, you know something. You know the mood of the story, you know the time period, and is it an extravagant set or is it a very minimalistic set? Think of that, and that's what the opening is. So each one of these has jobs to do to make the story keep going. So job of the opening, it gives you the setting, and setting is time. It is like, and when I say that, I mean time period. It could be also season. It could be what the humans that are there and the world that is there. It introduces the story world. Where is all this going to take place? It introduces the protagonist. This is the main character of the story. Make sure that that protagonist is front and center and very, very quickly introduced in the story. It sets up the story problem. If there is no problem, there is no story. There is something that is going to go wrong that the protagonist has to work through. And there is going to be an antagonist. There's going to be somebody that is coming against it. It also can be an antagonist is this negative force that creates the problem. It can be, Darth Vader in Star Wars, or it can even be like an illness, or it can be just challenges that the protagonist has to keep overcoming. So an antagonist doesn't have to be in a black cloak and breathe funny, but you have to have a negative force that's coming against you. Now, this is very important when I say all of these things, that you want to figure out as you go back. This is more of an editing job, but as you go back, as you have the opening, all of this needs to be subtle. You don't want to say it was the year and this is the person and this was his job and this is how much money he makes. And nobody wants a laundry list. All of this is done slowly and subtly in these opening scenes as you is you put little facts in, little description. If you're talking about horse and buggies, then immediately we know it's not a modern story. If you're talking about spaceships, then we're pretty sure that we have an idea of where this is. So all of these things are done subtly. But it's very important that you don't fill the backstory in for this opening scene. And the backstory is everything that's gone on to begin this story. You know, a story has to begin. If somebody is sitting there and operating on somebody in your opening scene, then they're a doctor. But we don't need their story of going through the medical school. Jerry Jenkins, who's somebody I also refer to later, give you his website, says that you never want your first couple of chapters to be throat clearing, which is kind of setting up the story and finally you get around to the story. Now, I will tell you that a lot of times I end up writing a lot of that throat clearing as I'm beginning a story. It just doesn't make it into the final product because that is more for me to know and me to get to know my characters and my story, but it wouldn't make compelling reading. And we don't want all of that in the opening. So the next thing is the inciting event. This is the big dun, da, da, da. It propels the story forward. So the job of the inciting event is to get everything going. If you don't have an inciting event, you don't have a story. And that is true whether it's in romance or whether it's an adventure or whether it's in a mystery. You know, all that we know for sure, the inciting event for a mystery is almost always somebody's dead and they've got to figure that out. But it has to have an inciting event. But even a romance has to have an inciting event. If there's no problem that happens, then Joe and Susie are together in the first chapter and there's no conflict. So we have to make there be a difficulty to get to the romance finally coming together. So the inciting event sets the protagonist on the journey. Something happens to mess with it. If you think back to that Star Wars example, Luke comes back and his aunt and his uncle have been killed and he has no choice but to leave and enter into a brand new life that he's never known before. And so something happens that is shocking that changes normal. It kind of makes normal no longer a viable option. The problem exists and it must be solved. It ends this whole setup that you've had so far and it sends the story hurtling forward. So this is the motor that gets everything going. It has the question, what's going to happen? How is this going to get resolved? I don't know. I better keep reading. And that is the job of the inciting event. This is often, the inciting event is when the antagonist really shows up or at least the force of the antagonist shows up. And that's what creates the problem that the protagonist is going to have to go on a journey, whether that's literal or figurative, to solve the problem that's there. So now that the journey has started, we have a series of crises. And it's conflict, conflict, conflict. Now, I am really not a huge conflict person. That's not one of my favorite areas of life. So in some ways, I resist this. But the reality is there has to be problems that get progressively worse in order to keep the story going. What you want is coming to an end of a chapter and the reader to go, I better read one more chapter because I need to know what happens. That is this idea of conflict. I had a son who was kind of a reluctant reader. And then I handed him Hardy Boys. And Hardy Boys always ends each chapter on a cliffhanger because we've just solved one problem, but by the time we get to the end of that chapter, there's another problem. And he would sit and read for hours because he just wanted to find out how was this going to get solved. That is the job of conflict. It keeps the story moving forward and it keeps the reader going, I got to come back and find out what happens. So the conflict, or the series of crises, either ways you look at that, it's this keep going. It propels the story forward. It forces the protagonist to have to act. that he or she is going to have to face maybe some fears. They're going to have to face their inner demons. They're going to have to decide to be brave and do something they don't really want to do. They're going to have to sacrifice something. All of these heroic things are going to come out, because at the point of conflict, the point of crisis is when we see true character. And so we get to see not only the protagonist succeed, but also fail. It's very important for our protagonists to fail. It shows their human side, and it allows them to have to dig down deeper and find this new part to come out and try again. It's a stage for the antagonist to shine. These crises are often from the antagonist. It's often something that's coming and showing up over and over and making it difficult. And it keeps the pages turning. And, you know, if you can lay down the book and not really worry about what happens next, then that's a sign that you need a little bit more conflict. So now we've had this, and the conflict takes up these turning point, this series of crises comes from Act 2. And then in the middle of that, you have what is the turning point. Up to now, we have crises, and we have this point where it's the point of no return. At this point, the protagonist maybe has been on this journey, but something is happening now that he's got to make a decisive decision that this is the journey that he's going to go on. Maybe this is in a romance, this is where one or the other, whoever's the reluctant person, might decide, I'm going to pursue this and I'm going to make this happen. And that's, now we have the next set of crises on the other side of the turning point, but has to be this point kind of right in the middle. Otherwise, the middle sort of sags. You know, have you ever seen one of those really old horses and their back just sort of sags in the middle? It's very easy to have a sagging middle part of the story. Right at that 50% part of the story, right in that middle point, you want to have where there is no other choice, but now there is this new effort, this new established sense of urgency. There's a choice, there's a dilemma. It's the point of no return. The protagonist must engage. If there's been any reluctance up to now, they're at a place where they now have to engage. They are taking their steps towards the final battle, the final hurdle, the final problem. This is the setup that is going to happen. And now every scene is moving forward to that point of conflict, final battle, it's not resolution. Resolution comes on the other side of that. But you're coming up to this showdown where now this story problem that was promised at the beginning is going to finally come to fruition on the other side of the crises that come after the turning point. And that is called the climax. The climax is this point of, is there any hope? There has to be a sense of doubt in the reader. Even if they know, of course, in the book, this is going to get resolved, it has to almost feel like, I think it's going to get resolved. Is it going to get resolved? Because I don't know. It seems like maybe it's almost past the point of hope. And that is a good climax. It's that point of so much tension that the reader, and I've done this, I've come to a point where you have this final moment of, oh my gosh, how is this going to happen? And maybe somebody's getting chased, or maybe there's a battle. And I actually sort of skim and read ahead really quick so I can find when this resolution is going to come. That is a great climax of a book. And then sometimes I have to go back and read a little more slowly to fill in the details that I skimmed over. That is where you're just so excited and you just want to know what happens. That is the job of the climax. It has to seem like the antagonist might win in order for it to be fully realized. The protagonist must use all that he or she has learned in the book. Like everything of the crises that have occurred so far come to this point, and then it's, okay, I'm going to have to use all that I've learned, and that way I'm going to finally come and be able to resolve this problem. It should be both inevitable and unexpected. And that's from K.M. Weiland. I'll talk about her a little more in a minute. But she's the one that I first got my best information about story structure from. And I loved that sentence, inevitable and unexpected. And that's a doozy to pull off. I mean, obviously that's not easy to do, but there is a sense of the inevitable will happen. But how can we tweak it just a little so it feels unexpected? And for the protagonist at this moment, they have that moment of revelation that if they pull down a little bit more inside, then they can, slay the antagonist. On a romance, it's if I'm finally willing to open up and be vulnerable to this person, then yes, our romance can be finally come together and I can have this man of my dreams. This is that moment. Everything builds up and there's a moment where this happens. And it's very important for that to feel satisfying for the reader, because they want to think that it might not. And then it does. And that's so exciting. And then we come to the end. And what I don't like is a book that has the climax and 2 pages later, you're done with the book. I like to have an ending. I like to have this denouement, the coming down and out of that climax and feeling this sense of satisfaction for the people that I have spent time invested reading about. So the ending has a job. It needs to resolve the story problems. And usually there's quite a few problems. There's a main biggie problem, but there should be other intriguing little side stories that are coming in along the way. And you want all of those to be able to be resolved in this ending. It reveals the growth and change in characters. Of the protagonist, yes, but then also of other characters as well. You want to have a sense that they have grown, they have changed, they have accepted things, and they're going to be able to go forward. Because what you want to do is set up your characters to keep on in your reader's mind after that back cover is closed. I love books where I actually feel like the characters are now my friends and I really would like to go have dinner with them sometime. And I'm pretty sure they're still married and they're hanging out. Maybe they've had a couple of kids, because I can imagine it. And that is a job well done in a story. So the story that I am writing is a fictionalized novel of the prodigal son. And as I began studying this, I realized, wow, I mean, I don't know why it surprised me that God knows exactly how to write a story, but it exactly followed story structure. And it was so fun. It just set up my outline before I ever began writing a scene. So you remember our classic parts, there's an opening, there's an inciting event, you have a series of crises, there's a turning point, then you have the climax, and then you have the end. So the opening is, it starts, a man has 2 sons. Okay, what's going to happen next? This thing happens. Amazingly, one of the sons asked for his inheritance, which was an incredibly unknown thing at the time. It was a horrible catastrophe. So now what happens? We have crises. The son goes, he wastes his money, becomes destitute. There's a famine in the land. Everything goes from everything's great and it just goes downhill. Then he ends up feeding pigs. And he decides, my dad's servants live better than I do. I think I'm going to go back. That's his turning point. But what's going to happen? Because he's really abandoned all of his family. The climax, he comes back and his father does this shocking thing of running to him with open arms and he throws him a party. Now, this parable has a very shocking ending because it ends with a question. It ends with the older brother being mad and then being offered an opening by his father, but we don't know what the older brother is going to do. So each one of these things, you can see how they are a part of this parable. All good stories, you can go look at books and you will find that it follows in some way or form this structure, because that's how stories build. And that's what we expect. And when they don't have form or structure, which is sort of a modern way of writing a story, it's very unsatisfying. And you get to the end of the story and it's sort of like, yeah, it won the Pulitzer Prize, but I'm kind of like, don't know how I feel now about these people, or I don't even know if they're happy or sad or whatever. That's not, to me, a very satisfying feeling. So I'm a big fan of story structure. You remember I said you can keep it complicated or simple. I wanted to bring this picture back up after we've talked about these pieces so that you can look and see. Now, can y'all see my little arrow on here on my screen? I don't know if you'll be able to see that. The first red line on her curve going up and down is the inciting event. And you can see there's a little bit of buildup before. There's one chapter before, and that's the inciting event. This thing happens that sets the story going. You have Act 1, which would be the first quarter of the book, and then you have a turning point. Now, we talked about a turning point in the middle. In her story, she has two turning points. There's this first big thing that happens that's a turning point. And then halfway through the book, between Acts 2 and 3, she has another turning point. And after the end of Act 3, you have the turning point. That's the emotional climax. That's this big final end. And then you have the redemption of the story is all in Act 4. And that is how she does this. It's a memoir book of a soldier that in Afghanistan, these British soldiers would take these donkeys in and they carried things and they did stuff. And this man could really work with donkeys. And so he was called the Donkey Whisperer. And so she writes his memoir for him. But it's a memoir, but it follows story structure. Once again, Susie Flory, highly recommend her material. So here's what I suggest for help. Now, these are websites, and I gave you the exact links on the handout. And if you just open the handout on your computer, they should be hyperlinks that if they're blue, you can just hit them and they should go to the website. If not, copy and paste it into the browser and you should be able to find these. So Helping Writers Become Authors is K.M. Weiland, and she's the one that I said that the ending needs to be inevitable and unexpected. She has a book, the first book I ever read about story structure, and it's called Structuring Your Novel. She also has a workbook that goes with this. So if you really want help and you want something that you can write your story into the workbook and then start writing your scenes, that's a great piece of material. I highly recommend her book. Her website is called Helping Writers Become Authors. She has a podcast that I love as well, blog post, and then she also has a lot of craft books. She has one called Creating Character Arcs, because character arcs, when you get into a story structure, character arc is something that will also be talked about. And that's sort of the journey that the character goes on. And it lines up with your story structure as well. Janice Hardy is someone that's new to me. She has something called a plot clock, and that's the way that she does it. Has some great free material online. That's what I give you a link to, and you can poke around with her stuff. Has some really great resources and ways to look at it. It actually is very similar to this, but it's just another terminology. Jerry Jenkins, he is the one who wrote all the Left Behind series. He's written it's kind of scary, like 700 books or something. I mean, some of them for kids, so they were shorter, but still like crazy numbers of books. He has a lot of great material. The link that I have for the article for his is really nice because it has other links embedded in that blog post that takes you to different ones describing different people's takes on story structure. That's something you really need to realize. This is not a cut and dry thing. This is different people have terminology that's a little different. Some are very complicated, some are very simple, but they all resemble each other and they all have basically the same pieces. Then Lisa Wingate, she's a very popular author. Her books are at the library. She has one that's very popular, Before We Were Yours is her book, and it's a very compelling story about some orphans. And she has a new book out. I just put my name on the waiting list for it at the library. I can't remember the name of it right now, but she's a great author. She has some really nice stuff online free. There's a picture she has that she draws of what she thinks is a story map. And she has this, these little boxes that keep getting bigger for the problems, showing that each problem, each conflict that comes up for her characters, then they get that one solved, but the next one's just a little bit bigger. And then the next one, and it builds all the way up to that final moment of the climax. So all those links I gave you will give you enough material to keep you busy. But if you want to know more, all you got to do is in Google or whatever, however you search, put in story structure for authors, and you will have more than you want or probably should read, because if you read all that, you'll never write anything. So this is to help us write more, not get us so busy in the process we never actually write. You can ask me how I know that that's a real thing. Okay, your story matters. I wanted to share with you something that John Piper wrote. John Piper is a pastor. He lives up in Minnesota. And I'm not, supporting him or not, but he wrote something on imagination that is something that has encouraged me very much through the years, because I think it's easy to think, well, everybody else's story, Lisa Wingate, her stories matter because they've sold a bunch of books, but I think your story matters. I think the way you see the world is just a little bit different than everybody else sees the world. And so the way you can write your compelling story is different than anybody else's. So this is what he says in the difference between the mind, which is very analytical and thinks, and the imagination. The imagination does not observe or analyze what we see. It imagines what we can't see, but what might really be there. Therefore, it's very useful in science because it helps turn up unseen explanations for things we don't understand and leads to all kinds of discoveries. Or it imagines a new way of saying things that no one has said before, as in the case of creative writing or music or art. Okay, and then he goes down to say, don't mistake what I'm saying. Poets and painters and preachers don't make God's beauty more beautiful. They make it more visible. They cut through the dull fog of our finite, fallible, sin-distorted perception and help us see God's beauty for what it really is. Imagination is like a telescope to the stars. It doesn't make them big. They're already big without the telescope. It makes them look like what they are. Imagination may be the hardest work of the human mind, and perhaps the most godlike. It is the closest we get to creation out of nothing. And so I love that picture that we are taking, when we write our story, we are taking something that's hard to understand and making it accessible to somebody. And it doesn't have to be millions of somebodies to be meaningful. It just has to be to somebody our story matters. And so we should write them. And I want to tell you again, I want to assure you that writing's hard, and it's hard for everybody. And you're not alone if you feel like it's hard. Writing is easy. All you do is stare at a blank sheet of page until drops of blood form on your forehead. There's nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and open a vein. Ernest Hemingway. So it is not easy for anybody. It's pulling something out of us. And every time we write down a word, it feels sort of like, maybe that's the wrong word. And it always feels that way. But we just keep writing. Choose to write. The 6 golden rules of writing: read, 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 and write, write, write. If you wait for inspiration to write, you're not a writer. You're a waiter. I love that one. You can always edit a bad page. You can't edit a blank page. So as we're talking about writing, and we're going to do editing a month from now, you can't apply what we'll talk about in editing unless you have writing on a page. And that is, for me, just a compelling reason to sit down every day and get a few more words on a page. It's very, very cumulative. Writing is not one and done. It's not, I don't have entire weekends to sit down and write, but I can find 15 minutes to an hour to write. I can choose to not watch a show and write at night, even though I'm tired. I can choose to get up a little earlier before everybody else does and write then. but I have to get words on a page in order to edit or to have a story. Okay, I'm going to keep going. My writing, and I will be having my books at our library's book sale. I have Unceasing, which is for parents on praying for their kids. The other is 31 Days Praying for My Daughter, and that is a book. It's a journal, and so you go through it as scripture and it has suggestions of prayer. Those are both available on Amazon. And I have a website that has a blog. I have now started a podcast called We're Not Done Yet. And it's also, if you go to my website, which is susankmacias.com, there's links to those podcasts. But it is specifically to women in the second half of life, that we have a calling and a purpose and things to do. And we're not too old. There's lots of people that started old. Laura Ingalls Wilder did not start writing her amazing books till she was 60 years old. And if she had thought she was too old to write, we wouldn't have Little House on the Prairie or any of the other wonderful books. So that is what my podcast is really about. Social media, I'm on all the social medias under my name, Susan K. Macias. I'd love to connect with you there if you want to reach out. But the whole point is to keep writing. And on the bad days, write a few words. And on days where it seems to flow, write as many as you can. But just keep coming back and keep writing and keep writing. And then come, if you want, to Hill Country Christian Writers. We meet through the library. The library is this incredible source and so supportive of writers. I'm just so blessed to be a part of Mammon Family Library, because that's not true of every library. And so we have this wonderful resources there. It's great to get your writing read by somebody else who can give you some feedback. And that's what our writers group does. So I highly recommend you come. The other, Judy Waters also has some programs she's going to be doing in January. And she's the great poobah of our writing group. She's the founder and the leader and an amazing teacher of writing skills. And so she will also be doing some online teaching. So please do that.